You don't belong. My daughter didn't even look at me when she said it. Her voice was casual, almost bored, as if she were discussing the weather. She kept her back to me, laughing with someone else, already folding me out of her new life like I was an old dress she no longer wanted. I stood there in the doorway, my hands still, my face calm. Inside, I felt the sharp, cold snap of something breaking, not just between us, but inside me. She had forgotten. Forgotten the years I had stayed home to raise her. Forgotten the nights I worked double shifts to give her the things she wanted. Forgotten that every inch of the life she lived had been built, in part, by me. I couldn't help but think back to all those years, those quiet moments when she was growing up, when I stayed home to raise her, when I sacrificed my own dreams to give her the best. I worked long hours, I bent over backward to give her everything she wanted, and what did I get in return? A few words, the ones she spoke to me just hours ago. You don't belong. I knew then that she was gone. But the house, the land, those were mine. She had never once thought about the legacy that home carried. She had always assumed it would be hers, a simple fact of life that she never questioned. And for a long time, I had assumed that too. But that assumption was built on the foundation of trust, and trust, as I had learned in those few, brutal words she had flung at me, was no longer something I could afford. The plan was simple: transfer the house to someone who needed it more, someone who would appreciate it for what it truly was. It would no longer be a symbol of family legacy for my daughter. It would be something far more important, a place of refuge. I thought of the women who had been abandoned, rejected, and forgotten, just as I had felt all those years. I wanted them to have the home that my daughter had taken for granted. I wanted them to feel what I had never felt: needed, appreciated, and respected. The paperwork wasn't complicated. It was just a matter of transferring ownership to a local women's shelter. I'd done it in the quietest, most unobtrusive way possible. There were no grand announcements, no confrontations. The deed would be recorded publicly, but I didn't need to be there to see the moment. I knew my daughter would never expect it. She was too wrapped up in her perfect new world, with her perfect new life. But this house, which she had boasted about in front of her in-laws, would no longer be a part of her fairy tale. I finished the paperwork 2 months before the wedding. It felt like a long time to wait, but I knew the timing had to be right. I had to let her enjoy her day. Let her feel that she had everything in the world. It wasn't until the morning of the wedding that I felt the true weight of my decision. It wasn't the moment of the transfer that hit me, it was the knowledge that I had done something that would irrevocably change everything for her. I watched the wedding unfold from a distance. The sounds of laughter and chatter drifted through the house. I had made my decision, and I was resolute in it. There was no going back now. My daughter would soon realize that nothing in her life was as secure as she thought. The house was gone. She would never walk through its doors again. The shelter now owned it, and they would take good care of it. They would give women a place to start over, a place to heal. They would create memories in that home that my daughter would never have a part in. When the deed transfer was recorded that morning, I sat quietly in my living room, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and waited. I didn't need to see her face when she found out. I knew she would. The public record was available to anyone who cared to look. And she would look. She always had. I could almost hear her frantic footsteps when she discovered it, the disbelief settling in as she realized the one thing she had taken for granted: the house was no longer hers. I didn't need to explain it to her. She would understand, eventually. I had nothing left to say. Later that evening, as the festivities were winding down, I knew she would finally reach out. She would try to call me, to ask what happened, to demand answers. But I wouldn't pick up. I wouldn't say a word. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. The silence was my answer. What would she do now? What would she say when she realized that all the dreams she had built around the house, all the plans she had made in front of her new husband and his family, would never come to fruition? I wondered if she would cry, if she would beg me to give it back. But it didn't matter. The house was gone, and in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had taken back my power. The weeks that followed were quiet. She didn't call. She didn't try to reach me. I saw her posts on social media, the happy photos from her wedding day. But something was different. There was a tension in her eyes now, a sense of knowing that things had shifted. The house was gone, But what hurt her more than losing a house was the realization that she had lost me. And that was something she could never get back. Then, one day, her call came. She was frantic, her voice trembling with confusion and anger. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Why did you sell the house? Why is it gone?" I let her rage for a few moments, letting her words hang in the air. Then, when there was a pause, I spoke, my voice steady, my heart calm. "It was never yours to take," I said. "It was always mine to give, and I gave it to someone who needs it more than you ever did." There was silence on the other end of the line. I didn't need to say more. She understood now. The truth was clear. The house had meant more than just walls and a roof. It had been my final act of defiance, my way of reclaiming everything I had lost. And now, it was hers to learn from, if she ever could. And so, I waited. I knew there would be no easy resolution, no moment where everything would be okay again. But I was okay. I had made my decision, and I would live with it. The house had been a symbol, a representation of all the years I had spent giving and giving, only to be pushed aside when I was no longer needed. But now, it was more than that. It was a place of refuge, a place of strength, and most importantly, it was a place where someone else would find what I had never had, a sense of belonging. And in that, I found my peace. I hadn't anticipated how quickly everything would unravel after I made my decision. The house, the land, the quiet transfer of ownership. At first, I thought it would all fade into the background, just another administrative task that would be forgotten in time. But as the weeks passed, I realized that the house had become something far more significant than I could have ever imagined. The shelter was thriving, and the community it had created was growing stronger each day. It was as if the house itself had taken on a new life, one that was far more meaningful than its past as a symbol of family legacy. The shelter was no longer just a safe place for women to find refuge, it was becoming a home for hope. The women who came through its doors were from all walks of life, each one had a different story, but they all shared a common thread of loss and redemption. Some had escaped abusive relationships, others had been abandoned by their families, and a few had simply lost their way. But all of them, in some way, reminded me of myself. They were searching for something they had been denied. They were looking for a chance to start over, to rebuild their lives just as I had once tried to do. I made the decision to visit the shelter one afternoon, just to see for myself how it was running. I told myself it was to check on things, to make sure everything was going as planned. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to see if I had made the right choice. I wanted to see if the place where my daughter had once dreamed of making her mark was now providing something more valuable than anything she could have ever imagined. As I walked up the path to the front door, I was struck by how different the house looked. The old stone steps that had once felt cold and uninviting now felt warm and welcoming. The paint on the walls was fresh, the windows were open, and the sound of laughter drifted from inside. It was strange, almost surreal, to think that this house, this very place that had been the backdrop to so many of my own struggles, was now a symbol of something entirely different. Inside, I was greeted by the shelter's director, a woman named Maria. She had started the organization a few years ago, and it was clear from the moment I met her that she was passionate about her work. She had a calm, steady presence that made you feel like everything was going to be okay, even in the midst of the most difficult circumstances. "Claire, it's so good to see you," she said, offering me a cup of tea. "I'm so glad you came by." I sat with her in the cozy living room, where several women were gathered, talking and laughing softly. There was something about the atmosphere that felt peaceful, even though the women here had all faced their own versions of hardship. It was like they had found solace in each other, a kind of unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone. As we talked, Maria shared stories about the women who had come through the shelter. There was Lena, a young woman who had been kicked out of her home by her parents when she came out as bisexual. There was Angie, a mother of two who had escaped an abusive relationship and was now working to rebuild her life. And then there was Evelyn, an older woman who had spent most of her life in an emotionally abusive marriage before finally finding the strength to leave. Each of their stories was heartbreaking in its own way, but what struck me most was how much they had all grown since coming to the shelter. They had all found a new sense of purpose, a new sense of self. And in a way, I felt that the house had become a part of that transformation. It was no longer just bricks and mortar, it had become a place of renewal, a place where lives were being rebuilt from the ground up. As I listened to Maria's stories, I began to realize just how much I had underestimated the power of this house. When I had made the decision to give it away, I had thought of it as a final act of closure, a way to sever the ties with my daughter and move on. But now, seeing the women in the shelter and hearing their stories, I realized that I had done something far more important. I had given them a chance at something they had never thought possible, a fresh start. I had given them the opportunity to heal, to rebuild their lives, and to find the strength they needed to move forward. And then, just as I was beginning to process this overwhelming feeling of pride, something unexpected happened. Maria told me that the shelter was planning to name the main common room after my late mother. It was a quiet gesture, one that might have seemed insignificant to some, but to me, it was everything. My mother had been a strong, resilient woman, someone who had always stood by me even when I felt like no one else did. She had passed away years ago, but I had never really had the chance to honor her properly. Now, through the shelter, her memory would live on in a way that was more meaningful than I could have ever imagined. "They're going to call it the Rose Room, after your mother," Maria said softly. "It just feels right. She was such a strong woman, and we thought it would be a beautiful tribute." I couldn't speak for a moment. The emotion caught in my throat. To think that my mother, the woman who had spent her life making sacrifices for others, would now have a place named in her honor, it was more than I had ever expected. It felt like a weight lifting off my chest, a sense of closure that I hadn't even realized I needed. But even as I felt this deep sense of fulfillment, I couldn't help but think of my daughter. She had always taken the house for granted. It had been hers in her mind for so long that she hadn't even stopped to appreciate its true value. She had never considered that it could be used for something greater than herself. And now, as I sat in this room, surrounded by women whose lives were being transformed, I wondered if she would ever understand the true impact of what I had done. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about legacy, the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in bricks and mortar or inherited possessions. It was about the lives that had been touched, the women who had found refuge, the stories that were still unfolding. The house, once a symbol of my daughter's entitlement, had now become a place of hope, a place where women could reclaim their lives and their futures. A few weeks later, my daughter called me. She was frantic, her voice shaky and filled with desperation. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I don't have anywhere to go. Please, can I come stay with you?" It was a call I had expected, though not quite in the way I imagined. She had lost everything, her husband, her home, her sense of security. I could hear the fear in her voice as she tried to make sense of everything that had fallen apart. But this time, there was no sympathy in my heart. I didn't say much, just that she could come. But when she arrived at the shelter, the reality of her situation hit her. She saw the women there, each one struggling but finding strength. She saw the Rose Room, the room named for my mother. It was a quiet, humbling moment for her, one I knew she would never forget. My daughter had learned the hard way that nothing in life is guaranteed. The house she thought was hers was now a symbol of something far more important, a place of refuge, a place where women were finding their strength again. She had taken everything for granted, but now she had to face the reality of what I had done. And in that moment, I knew the legacy I had created was more than I could have ever hoped for.